It's pretty hard to make it up. We have a fire in a electricity substation. And what happens? Heathrow Airport is shut for 24 hours. How? How could that possibly happen? We all know that the infrastructure in Britain is pretty ropey. We know that just in time and just enough has replaced ready, prepared, secure and resilient. But it takes a mess like the Heathrow one to bring this all into a perspective, to ask some substantial questions. Now, the first reaction to a mess like this is, it's got to be someone's fault. So who should we blame? Shall we blame the airport? No, of course we should blame National Grid and the distribution company, because after all, it's their substation that went down. But then we discover, well, actually, there was plenty of power for Heathrow, and the blame game shifts to Heathrow's management and the way its backup energy systems interact, or in this case, it's not even backup, it's the supplies from other substations to the site. And, there's a purpose to the blame game. You do need to work out who mucked up. But usually that leads us to believe that if only one person had done something different, it would all be fine. And actually, in most of these cases, what you discover is that it's a miracle that these things don't happen more often. So the next stage, after we found someone to blame, is to send in the regulators. Well, in they march to see what's happened, to learn the lessons and make sure it won't happen again. When the power systems failed in the northeast some years ago during Storm Arwen, because the wind blew from the north, not the south, we had an investigation. Actually, in that case, more of a whitewash than a proper look at the resilience of distribution networks. But this time it's pretty curious. So you would think that since it's an airport failure, the economic regulator of the airport, the CAA, would lead an inquiry. No, we're sending in the system operator, the NESO, to look at what? The implications for the energy systems of what appears to be a failure inside Heathrow to coordinate its backup. So why? And that, I think, is all about where ministers see their vulnerability and less about what the fundamental issues are at stake. And when we see one of these incidents, and we go through this process of, first of all, let's do the blame game, then let's add in the regulators. Time passes, we move on, we're told this will never happen again, and we get to accept that this is the normal sort of thing that happens. And normalising the lack of resilience in infrastructure is now pretty much universal. Does anyone seriously think that this Prime Minister will be any good than the previous Prime Ministers at fixing the potholes? We're told that the total cost of the damage to our road systems is something of the order of 17 billion. Who knows? But it's a big number. But the number of times that we've listened to a Prime Minister telling us he's going to fix it. In the same way, I remember watching Rishi Sunak going to visit potholes. Other Prime Ministers have done the same. But you know what? We've come to terms with the fact that our roads are in a terrible state, and we've got to expect nothing much better from it. Then we look at the state of our water systems. We are up in arms about the sheer number of hours that raw sewage is going into our rivers. And it's true that it's always been doing this, but in the past we haven't perhaps noticed because we didn't even know what was going on, because the water companies didn't even know where their assets were and didn't monitor the outcomes. So we're going to get the rivers fixed. And what happens when there's an outcry like this? Well, blame game first. Must be all the fault of the water companies, and we're going to make those water companies pay. They're going to sort out the job, and then you know what? We found someone to blame, we found the guilty party, and off we go. And what happens? Nothing much. In the water company case and in the water sewage case, the next step is to send in the regulators. The Environment Agency, Ofwat, come down with some very large fines on the companies and tell them they must do better. In the water case, we even send in the Secretary of State, who tells us there isn't going to be any sewage in Lake Windermere in the Lake District by 2030. Well, it is possible that pigs might fly, but it's very unlikely. But that's the sort of scale of unlikeliness about the fact there'll be no sewage or the claim that there'll be no sewage in Lake Windermere in 2030. That's never going to happen. And we get used to the idea, well, that's just the state of our rivers. And we slowly ease up on the argument we should do something about it. When it comes to electricity networks, so far there has been very little public outcry. And the assumption is that, well, they must be in pretty good shape. And in many cases, apart from what Storm Arwen revealed, they probably are. But look below the surface and ask yourself, are our networks fit for the purposes that are there? And ask why we might worry about security of supply. Then it's a little bit more concerning. What we've got is a much more intermittent electricity system, lots of renewables that work when the sun shines and when the wind blows, and when the sun doesn't shine, the wind doesn't blow, they don't. And we've got, at the same time, an economy which is digitalizing, where communication, cyber networks, etc., are the norm rather than exception, and where security supply is vastly more important now than it's ever been. In the past, when we had significant power cuts, and you have to go all the way back to the 1970s for that, when the miners struck repeatedly, industry could turn off. We went to a 3-day week under the Edward Heath government. Painful, but it's manageable. Try turning off the banking system today. Try turning off your broadband supplies. Turn off the internet. Turn off a whole series of critical infrastructure dependent digital activities. Almost everything, even farming, depends upon a pretty continuous supply of electricity to enable digital technologies to work. So this brings us all back to Heathrow. Now, supposing the blame game decides it's all Heathrow's fault. I'm no expert. I don't understand how the systems work. It may or it may not be their fault. But just for imagine, suppose the blame game identifies the villain and then forces heads to roll, etc. What will happen? Well, the lesson at Heathrow is that next door to it, a data centre, the ARC data centre, carried on functioning when the substation went down. Why? Because it had backup diesel generation. So you might think, well, why doesn't Heathrow get itself a serious power station? Why doesn't it get 2 power stations just in case one breaks down? And ask yourself that question for every bank, every data centre, every communications network, every hospital, every school, every university, every car system supports, and so on and so forth. And what you end up with is a world in which we don't think that the transmission and distribution system for electricity and electricity generation should be resilient. We argue that, well, it provides a basic service, but it may go wrong. When it goes wrong, well, I'll tell you what, we'll simply turn on some diesel generators. Now, this is a very retrograde step. It's true that emergency services, etc., ought to have their own backup supplies. But think of the costs involved in the economy not relying on the electricity system to provide its security supply, but relying instead on its own mini generators all over the place, many of them which will be diesel. Further down the track, big tech might even go as far as to build mini nukes to back up themselves. But the costs of this are much, much higher to the economy as a whole than having a well-functioning, very secure, well-backed up electricity transmission and distribution system. In the Heathrow case, it turns out there were 3 substations, or so we're told, supporting the airport, and you can argue that's pretty good backup. But what happens to the west of London, down that corridor all the way to Swansea, when loads of data centres come along, when lots and lots of high-tech businesses locate along that frame? What happens to security supply? Well, the answer is they can all look after their own, or we can seriously overbuild the electricity networks, the substations and so on, to ensure that it's the system we turn to back up supplies, not our individual generators standing at the side of each company. And by the way, standing empty and non-operable, a cost without a return, which is added to the already extremely high industrial energy costs that we face in the UK. This is really retrograde, and it makes much more sense for most companies to outsource their security of supply to their distribution and transmission links rather than the other way around. Why should it be Heathrow that's backing up Heathrow as opposed to some combination of a local generator, a distribution network, and yes, National Grid doing it as well? As I say, in the Heathrow case, it's effectively what's already happening. But the bigger picture tells you that if you really want resilience in your economy, you do need a much bigger, overbuilt system. You need the capacity, when we look at the other infrastructures, to not only have fixed all the sewage works, but have the backup support when anything goes wrong. It's not enough to patch and mend the roads. You have to have a serious look at making sure those roads are resilient so they don't have future potholes, and it's not very often that it occurs. And so on and so forth. The lesson I draw from the Heathrow case is not the blame game. It's not what the regulators are going to turn up, although I'm sure that they'll find plenty to do for their many employees. It is that we haven't started to think about how seriously we need to invest in our core infrastructures for the resilience of our economy in a digital world with AI and data centres and, yes, defence as well. These are energy intensive and we need the capacity to do that. And we have to ask a difficult question. It's not just the networks need the resilience when it comes to energy. We are opting for less resilient and reliable energy supplies, by definition, intermittent energy supplies, which then need extra resilience, extra capacity layered on top. So if we want to do net zero in 58 months for the electricity system, and we want to have secure supplies, and we want to have resilience in our network, as they say, you ain't seen nothing yet. And ask yourself whether customers are prepared to pay what this is going to cost, and you'll get a very similar answer to asking customers whether they're prepared to pay for a resilient sewage and indeed water system or a resilient set of roads. So it's game on, but it's altogether a more serious game, and we're tinkering around the edges on infrastructure against the scale of what we really need to do. So, to put it simply, we need to get on with it. And if Heathrow's a bit of a wake-up call for that, well, some good may come out of this mess. However, past experience says these crises are not big enough, they're not serious enough to actually get us to do anything yet. That's still to come. But it will, because these energy systems, these infrastructure networks in their current form are not resiliently sustainable. And therefore, they will not be sustained. Thank you.